Okay, so we've talked about the kind of political, religious goings on and kind of laid the groundwork for what's going on politically during the 17th century. But now I want to talk about the literature that kind of comes out of this period. I mean, there's tons of stuff. I wish I could go on and on and on. But I have divided this up into the metaphysical poets and the Cavalier poets. So the first group is the earlier group, the one that's writing during the reign of um, James, the Jacobean era, as they call it, and that group is called the Metaphysical Poets, and this is a 17th century movement. And I want to point out really quickly that it is important to note that these poets weren't exactly in the same school of thought like other people of other literary movements. The title of metaphysical wasn't given to this type of poetry until probably like the 1750s, 1760s by the 18th century writer who we will talk about, Samuel Johnson. And he meant it in a kind of facing kind of way. It wasn't a term of endearment. But the metaphysical poets really parallel the arrival of the Renaissance and the Church Reformation and the humanism that follows. This period, the metaphysical poets kind of coincide with the death of Elizabeth I, and the subsequent weakening of the strong monarchy of the Tudors. The metaphysical poets reacted against Elizabethan literary style and ideas. They rejected this conventional ideal of love held by Elizabethan poets and their indifference to real experiences, where the Elizabethans saw love as a romantic pleasure to be described in general terms. The metaphysical poets attempted to analyze personal and intimate experiences of love, and indeed other experiences on particular occasions. The emphasis was on the experience, things happening now. And so immediacy was a particular characteristic of the poetry. They also rebelled against accepted ideas, and accepted kind of poetic, this ornate language, rhythm, rhyme scheme, and cliched metaphors and ideas. Like, for example, a rose by any other name would be as sweet. I mean, Shakespeare's kind of use of the rose as this image for love. I mean, that cliched kind of those cliched ideas. But they also rebelled against the deification of nature and the notion of the greatness of kings. Their themes were usually serious and often satirical. They're witty, they're funny. Religion was a constant topic because there was an uncertainty as to what was true religion. And they really kind of take these kind of moral stances or these moral ideas and kind of question them or put them beside. You'll see what I mean when we talk about the flea. There was little reference to contemporary matters, political or otherwise. But their poems are also not aimed at a public readership, but rather at the intellect of their kind of group. If you look at metaphysical poetry, metaphysical as a definition, meta means beyond, the reality beyond what is perceived by the senses, is what the OED classify or defines metaphysical as. But these poems really deal with the relationship between concrete forms and spiritual and emotional constructs. So, some qualities or characteristics of the metaphysical poets include um, the use of ordinary speech. They are very conversational. It's simple, um, use of word choice and of rhyme scheme. But that ordinary speech is mixed with puns, paradoxes, and conceits, which we'll talk about in a second. There's this exaltation of wit, which in the 17th century meant a nimbleness of thought, a sense of fancy or imagination of fantastic or whimsical nature, and the originality in figures of speech. So we're done with these trite metaphors and trite figures of speech, and now we're going to look at how I can or how we can manipulate our language to make that something original. They use the abstruse terminology drawn from science or law, and often these poems are presented in the form of arguments. And they kind of really look to draw on the relationship between the soul and the body, the what is beyond the physical. So, a metaphysical conceit. This is one of those key concepts and key terms that is incredibly important to understanding any metaphysical poem. And the metaphysical conceit is this extended metaphor that relies on logic or the manipulation of it to prove a point. It's paradoxical in nature, in the fact that it causes a shock to the reader by the strangeness of the objects being compared. Some examples from what we read today: lovers as a compass, or marriage or sexual relations as a flea. So, having said that, that kind of contrasts to the other school of thought, the Cavalier poets. And the Cavalier, before we can kind of look at what Cavalier poets are, I think it's important to define the term cavalier both as a noun and an adjective. A cavalier as a noun is a mounted soldier. But it is also, remember, the name of Charles the First's supporter. So these guys are wealthy, they are aristocratic, and they are these kind of supporters of the way things have always been. However, that's also, you can look at cavalier as an adjective, which also kind of defines their poetry as this idea of being carefree, nonchalant, jaunty, where there's this kind of lack of seriousness in language, or in this, they don't take things too seriously. So the Cavalier poets, they are Cavalier in the sense not only of being royalists, but in the sense that they distrust the over earnest, the too intense. They accept and value the ideal of the Renaissance gentleman who is at once lover, soldier, wit, man of affairs, musician, and poet. But they kind of reject the notion, or abandon the notion of his being this pattern of Christian chivalry. So he's no longer this ideal Christian. Instead of, he's kind of the opposite. And that kind of goes back to that. If you look at them as the Cavalier poets as supporters of Charles the First, they're going to reject those Puritan ideals that those kind of members of Parliament or the Roundheads kind of value, like the importance of denying personal pleasures in order to prepare for meeting God in death. So they are Yes, so he's not. They're not stuck on these kind of Christian ideas. They in fact avoid the subject of religion um, at all, and they treat life cavalierly, and they kind of treat the convention of poetry cavalierly too. And some characteristics of that type of poetry. The primary purpose of this kind of poetry is not to really kind of explore these deep faceted, what is the nature of things, let me look beyond what I see. It's not the same as the metaphysical poets. The primary purpose of these is to entertain. They are very straightforward. They have this, they also have this kind of conventional style, or sense of speech patterns. In a way, they kind of throw back to that Elizabethan style of poetry, that and think about it in some ways, like it's nostalgic in a way, because they want to go back to a time where they did have this kind of golden age ruler, where things did make sense, where there was order, where there was consistency, and this kind of regularity, and that's kind of mimicked in their poetry. So we had this regular rhythm patterns, and they kind of return back to those traditional metaphors that the metaphysical poets reject and abandon. Some key concepts that deal with metaphysical, or not metaphysical poets, Cavalier poets, are these two Latin phrases: memento mori, remember you'll die, remember death. And because of this carpe diem, or seize the, it literally means pluck the day, but seize the day. So make hay while the sun is shining, and these poems are full of that kind of idea. So I am going to stop here, and I am going to talk about a few of our poems that we have read for this week, and with beginning with the metaphysical poets, and then ending with the Cavalier poets. So stay tuned.